Africa, a land of empires, kingdoms, and knowledge. Yet when most of the world thinks of Africa, the images that come to mind are poverty, slavery, and colonization. But was this always Africa's story? The truth is simple, yet hidden. Africa's history was deliberately erased. Centuries of colonial powers, missionaries, and scholars worked to silence African voices, rewrite their past, and replace their stories with European myths. What you know about Africa today is not Africa's true history. It is the version colonizers wanted the world to believe. This documentary reveals how Africa's memory was stolen, why the silence still echoes today, and how Africans are reclaiming their past. Before Europe carved Africa into colonies, this continent thrived with civilizations that rivaled and often surpassed the so-called Old World. The Mali Empire, under Mansa Musa, was a hub of trade, gold, and scholarship, housing the legendary Timbuktu libraries, thousands of manuscripts covering science, medicine, astronomy, and law. The Kingdom of Congo had a centralized political system, vibrant art, and international diplomacy before Europeans ever set foot on its shores. Great Zimbabwe built monumental stone cities, astonishing travelers with their scale. The Ethiopian Empire traced its lineage to the Queen of Sheba and held one of the earliest Christian civilizations on Earth. Yet today, these empires are footnotes in world history textbooks, overshadowed by tales of European exploration. Why? Because colonizers had a mission: to convince the world that Africa had no history worth remembering. When Portuguese sailors first arrived in West Africa in the 15th century, they encountered societies that were organized, wealthy, and literate. Instead of acknowledging this, they began recording Africans as savages in need of civilization. This narrative was not innocent, it was political. By portraying Africa as primitive, colonizers could justify the slave trade, and later, the scramble for Africa. History became a weapon. Every European explorer's book, every colonial report, chipped away at Africa's achievements and replaced them with stories of darkness, superstition, and backwardness. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where European powers divided Africa like a cake, was not just about land. It was also about history. Colonizers rewrote African stories to divide tribes, delegitimize leaders, and erase unity. Ancient kings were rebranded as tribal chiefs. Empires were minimized into villages. Advanced political systems were described as chaotic. By erasing Africa's past, colonizers ensured Africans would doubt their own greatness, making it easier to control them. Unlike Europe, much of Africa's history was passed down through oral traditions, griots, poets, storytellers who carried the memory of nations. Colonizers understood this and systematically destroyed it. In schools, African children were forbidden to speak their mother tongues. Missionaries labeled indigenous stories as pagan myths. Colonial laws silenced griots and banned traditional gatherings. In some cases, entire libraries were burned. Manuscripts from Timbuktu were smuggled or destroyed. Knowledge accumulated over centuries vanished overnight. Missionaries and colonial textbooks. Missionaries didn't just bring religion, they brought European-style schools and books. These books rewrote history by leaving Africa's achievements out. The goal: teach African children to see the world only through a European lens. Whose history was taught? African kids studied about Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Shakespeare, Columbus, European figures. But they never heard about Sundiata Keita, founder of Mali Empire, Askia, the Great, Songhai ruler, or other African leaders who shaped their own continent. This created the idea that greatness only existed in Europe, not Africa. Geography rewritten: local rivers, mountains, and cities were often renamed by colonizers, for example, Lake Victoria, instead of its indigenous name. In school, children learned these European names, erasing the original African ones. This meant even the land itself was taught as if it belonged to Europe. Heroes and ancestors dismissed, African warriors, queens, scientists, and leaders were either ignored or mocked as tribal or primitive. Meanwhile, European conquerors and explorers were glorified as civilizers and heroes. This brainwashed children into admiring Europeans while feeling shame about their own people. The purpose of this system wasn't accidental. It was deliberate psychological control. By shaping the minds of African children, the system created generations who would see Europe as advanced and Africa as backward. It produced Africans who could serve the colonial system without questioning it. Colonial education was not about knowledge, it was about indoctrination. It erased African history, silenced African pride, and made children grow up believing Europe was the center of civilization, while Africa had no past worth remembering. African heritage in European museums. Major European museums like the British Museum London, the Louvre Paris, and Berlin's Ethnological Museum are filled with African treasures. The irony is that these priceless artifacts are rarely seen in Africa itself, where they actually belong. The looting of treasures example, the Benin bronzes, 1897 British forces invaded the Kingdom of Benin, present-day Nigeria, looted thousands of bronze and ivory masterpieces, and then burned the city. Similar theft happened across the continent. Nubian artifacts from Sudan, relics from Mali, Ethiopia, Congo, and Egypt were taken during colonial conquests and expeditions. Africa's greatest cultural wealth was systematically drained to Europe. How Europe reinterpreted the art after looting, another injustice followed. The artifacts were misrepresented. European curators displayed them as primitive objects or tribal curiosities, rather than evidence of advanced African civilizations. This created the false impression that Africa had no real history of sophistication or innovation. Cultural disconnection today. The descendants of the people who created these treasures cannot see them in their own countries. Most remain locked away in Western museums, far from their origins. This means colonialism didn't just steal Africa's resources, it also stole its memory and pride, and continues to hold it captive. Europe didn't only steal Africa's treasures, it also stole their meaning, by keeping them in European museums and presenting them as exotic curiosities. Colonizers erased Africa's achievements twice, first by looting them, then by distorting their story. Who wrote the books? In the 19th and 20th centuries, Europe and America developed African studies, but the scholars who wrote these histories were almost always Europeans, not Africans. This meant Africa's story was told through colonial eyes, not from the perspective of its own people. The Dark Continent myth textbooks described Africa as dark, meaning mysterious, uncivilized, and backward. This was propaganda. It justified colonization by painting Africa as a land that needed saving by Europeans. Erasing civilizations, advanced African empires like Nubia, Mali, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe were often ignored. When their achievements were too obvious to deny, Europeans credited them to outsiders, Egyptians being not really African, or Zimbabwe being built by Arabs, etc. This denied Africans ownership of their own history. Distorting slavery, Western textbooks simplified the transatlantic slave trade as Africans selling their own people. This ignores the truth. The massive European demand, shipping networks, and global markets drove slavery on an industrial scale. By shifting blame onto Africans, Europe tried to hide its responsibility. Generations of lies. These distortions were repeated in schools, universities, and media for over a century. As a result, the global image of Africa was shaped by colonial lies, primitive, dark, tribal, and dependent on Europe. Even today, many people around the world still see Africa through these distorted lenses. Western textbooks didn't just misrepresent Africa, They rewrote history to justify colonization and slavery, by erasing Africa's greatness and blaming Africans for their own suffering. These narratives shaped global perceptions that still affect Africa today. Africa did not stay silent, even though colonial powers tried to erase and distort African history. Many African scholars, writers, and leaders rose to defend the truth. Their work became a form of resistance, not with weapons, but with knowledge, culture, and education. Jake Anta Diop Senegal, a historian, anthropologist, and scientist. He challenged Western claims that ancient Egypt was not African, proving with linguistic, cultural, and genetic evidence that it was fundamentally African. His work restored pride by showing Africa's deep role in world civilization. Ngujwa Thiano Kenya, a writer and thinker who fought against the dominance of colonial languages like English. He argued that true decolonization means Africans writing, reading, and learning in their mother tongues. For him, language was not just communication, it was the carrier of culture, memory, and identity. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana. Then Julius Nyerere, Tanzania, both were independence leaders and thinkers. They emphasized teaching African history in African schools so future generations could know their true heritage instead of colonial lies. They believed political independence meant nothing without cultural and historical independence. The core message across all these voices, the central truth was, we cannot be free until we reclaim our past. Real freedom is not just breaking colonial rule, but also breaking colonial thinking, restoring Africa's identity, history, and pride. These African scholars, writers, and leaders turned history itself into a battlefield. By reclaiming language, proving Africa's ancient achievements, and reshaping education, they ensured that Africa's voice would never again be silenced. Even today, Africa's story is incomplete. In classrooms across the world, children learn about Greece, Rome, and China, but rarely about Mali, Axum, or Great Zimbabwe. Museums still resist returning stolen artifacts. Western movies often portray Africa as a land of poverty and war, ignoring its civilizations. This silence is not accidental, it is the echo of colonization. But a new generation is rewriting the story. African scholars are digitizing ancient manuscripts of Timbuktu. Activists are demanding the return of stolen artifacts. Filmmakers and writers are telling Africa's story from within, not through foreign eyes. The internet has become a battlefield of memory. For the first time in centuries, Africans can speak directly to the world, and the world is listening. Africa's history was not lost. It was stolen, silenced, and distorted. But history has a way of resurfacing. The griots may have been silenced, the libraries may have been burned, but the memory of Africa lives on in its people, its art, its languages, and its resistance. To know Africa is to know the truth about humanity itself. And the truth is clear. Africa has always been a land of greatness, and no colonizer's pen can erase that. History, it is not just a record of what happened. It is a weapon. For centuries, this weapon was used against Africa. Colonizers rewrote the story to make Africa look empty, primitive, voiceless. But the truth, Africa was never silent. Its empires built cities of stone. Its scholars wrote libraries of wisdom. Its queens stood against armies and empires. Its people carried knowledge that shaped the world. Narrator's slightly rising tone. Yes, much was stolen. Artifacts taken, manuscripts burned, languages suppressed. But memory cannot be erased. It hides in the rhythms of the drum, in the patterns carved into stone, in the proverbs whispered by elders. It lives in the blood of generations who never surrendered their dignity. And now, the silence is breaking. African historians are reclaiming the story. Writers are telling truths hidden for centuries. Filmmakers are giving faces to forgotten kings and queens. Even in the digital age, A new battlefield has opened, and Africa's voice is louder than ever. And you, watching this, are part of that awakening. By learning, by questioning, by sharing, you are helping to rebuild the bridge between Africa's past and its future. This is not just about correcting textbooks. It is about restoring pride. It is about giving the next generation a mirror where they can see their greatness. It is about telling the world, Africa is not the shadow of history. Africa is history. Africa makes history. This is Africa Untold, and the story has only just begun.